On a mild evening in late autumn, when the rain had settled into the patient habit of touching every window without asking to come in, Edwin Vale unlocked the side door of the Provincial Wallpaper Archive and stepped into the pleasant smell of paper, paste, dust, and old wood. On a mild evening in late autumn, when the rain had settled into the patient habit of touching every window without asking to come in, Edwin Vale unlocked the side door of the Provincial Wallpaper Archive and stepped into the pleasant smell of paper, paste, dust, and old wood. The archive occupied the upper 2 floors of a building that had once been a furniture warehouse, though no furniture had been stored there for nearly 70 years. From the street it presented 5 broad windows, 3 narrow windows, and a stone lintel carved with the date 1886. The 6 had weathered more than the other numbers and looked a little tired. Edwin was fond of this. It seemed suitable that even the date should have softened at the edges. Inside, the stairs rose at an angle that encouraged a sensible pace, with shallow hollows in the middle of each tread where clerks and porters had passed in calm succession. The brass handrail was cool beneath his palm. Somewhere above, a small electric clock made a sound like a knitting needle gently tapping a teacup. Edwin was the archive's evening cataloguer, a title grander than the work and therefore, in his opinion, quite charming. His task that night was to examine shelf Run D, Bay 12, where 47 sample books had been waiting for revised labels since the previous spring. Nothing unfortunate would happen if he finished only 46. Nothing remarkable would happen if he finished all 47. This was the sort of balanced arrangement Edwin liked. He hung his damp coat on the 3rd peg in the staff room, placed his canvas lunch bag beside the kettle, and changed from his outdoor shoes into soft brown slippers with rubber soles. The slippers were not official equipment, but after years among quiet collections he considered them an appropriate courtesy to the paper. The staff room contained a square table, 2 wooden chairs, 1 padded chair of uncertain age, and a notice about rinsing teaspoons. The notice had been typed in blue ink and framed, which had given it an authority far beyond its subject. Edwin filled the kettle to the line he had marked with a pencil, enough for 2 cups and a little left over. As it heated, he opened the cupboard and selected a broad cream mug decorated with a green band. The archive owned 7 mugs, none matching. There was a thin white one that made tea cool too quickly, a heavy blue one with a handle suited to a gloved hand, and a yellow one bearing the words Conference Center in letters that had survived the conference center itself. Edwin preferred the cream mug because it asked nothing of him. He carried his tea into the main room and switched on the lamps 1 row at a time. Pools of amber light appeared along the work tables, leaving the high rafters in a comfortable dusk. The long shelves held sample books laid flat, their spines turned outward and their cloth covers ranging through the subdued colors of administrative life, bottle green, ledger brown, navy, oxblood, and a gray that might once have intended to be violet. Rolled wallpapers rested in map drawers. Loose fragments lay between sheets of acid-free tissue. Each had a number, and every number had a card, and every card was slowly being copied into a computer whose beige casing harmonized nicely with the oldest labels. Before beginning, Edwin walked to Bay 12 and stood for a moment with his hands loosely behind his back. The 47 volumes were arranged by acquisition date rather than by pattern, manufacturer, color, or year. This was not a mistake. It was merely the system inherited from a curator named Miss Barlow, who had believed that objects ought to remember the order in which they entered a place. Thus a book of modest striped papers from 1903 sat beside a collection of metallic sunbursts from 1927, followed by 6 floral borders presented by a retired decorator in 1981. Edwin found this neighborliness reassuring. Archives, like boarding houses, often accommodated people who would never otherwise have met. He wheeled over the low trolley. Its left front wheel squeaked once per revolution, but very softly, as if embarrassed. On the upper shelf he placed a pencil, a bone folder, a magnifying glass, a soft goat hair brush, cotton tape, a stack of new labels, and the ledger for shelf run D. On the lower shelf he set 2 grey foam wedges to support open volumes. The arrangement took several minutes because the magnifying glass rolled whenever the trolley crossed a seam in the floorboards. Edwin solved this by laying it on a folded cloth. It was a small solution, unlikely to be commemorated, and it improved the evening considerably. The first sample book was labelled Dawson and Pike, Decorative Papers, 1898 to 1901. Its cover was green buckram darkened along the edges by many hands. Edwin lifted it with both palms and placed it on the wedges. When he opened the front board, a dry, warm scent rose from the leaves, faintly sweet and mineral, like a cupboard containing old flour and clean bricks. The first paper displayed narrow cream lines on a field of brown. Each line was not quite straight. Under the magnifying glass it wandered delicately, rising and falling by the width of a thread. The effect from a distance was formal, close at hand it seemed to have been drawn by someone travelling in a gently moving carriage. Edwin brushed a little dust from the gutter and read the manufacturer's pencil note, dining room, quiet aspect, 7D per roll. He liked the phrase quiet aspect. It might have described the wallpaper, the room, or perhaps the diner. 7 pennies had bought a roll before decimal currency, though the roll itself was not always the length a modern decorator expected. British wallpaper had once been sold in pieces, and pieces varied by custom and tax law. There had even been a wallpaper tax, introduced in the 18th century, because governments have long possessed a special talent for noticing any surface that remains untaxed. Manufacturers sometimes avoided it by selling plain paper to be decorated after hanging. Edwin imagined a patient householder watching leaves being stamped onto the wall one at a time, and felt that the archive's own pace was almost brisk. He checked the accession number inside the cover, compared it with the ledger, and typed the revised description, 42 leaves, machine-printed domestic papers, predominantly linear and small floral patterns, minor edge wear. The computer keys had a deep, padded action. Each letter arrived with a muted clack. Edwin did not hurry the description. Predominantly was a word worth typing at a reasonable speed. He measured the book's height, width, and thickness, first in millimeters and then again because the metal ruler had shifted against the cloth. The second measurement agreed with the first, an uneventful success that gave him quiet satisfaction. The next pages contained sprigs of blue flowers scattered over oatmeal backgrounds. The flowers were too simplified to belong to any confident species. Some resembled forget-me-nots, others might have been small asters, and one looked rather like a blue button viewed through rain. Pattern designers often borrowed freely from botany. They removed inconvenient stems, persuaded blossoms to face in useful directions, and arranged plants that flowered in different months into permanent good relations. On these pages spring and late summer shared the same 6-inch repeat. No petal fell. No seed head browned. The little garden had performed the same mild gesture for more than a century. Edwin turned each leaf by sliding the bone folder underneath and lifting just enough for his fingers to take over. The paper made a soft muscular sound, not exactly a crackle and not exactly a sigh. He recorded water stains, tears, missing corners, and the silver trails left by fish moths long ago. Silverfish, despite their name, are neither silver in the ceremonial sense nor fish in any practical sense. They prefer starch, glue, and quiet darkness, making an archive of wallpaper something like a hotel with edible curtains. The building had not seen one for years, but the old curator had maintained small inspection traps under the shelves, each dated in precise handwriting. Edwin checked the nearest trap. It contained dust, one thread, and nothing with legs. At 7:30, rain thickened against the west windows. It traced the glass in overlapping paths, gathering at the bottom of each pane before slipping out of sight. The archive roof answered with an even hush. Edwin closed the first book, tied it with cotton tape, and wrote its new shelf label in black archival ink. His handwriting inclined slightly to the right. He had once tried to make it vertical, believing this looked more official, but the letters gradually leaned again as though listening to something beyond the margin. He allowed them their preference. The finished label read D12001, a modest address for a substantial object. The second volume had been assembled by a traveling salesman named Mr. Albert Preece. His name was stamped inside in fading violet ink, followed by representative for the northern counties. The volume was thick, with brass posts holding the leaves together and a handle built into the spine. Edwin pictured Mr. Preece carrying it into drapers' shops and decorators' offices, setting it on counters polished by sleeves. It would have traveled by railway, tram, hired cab, and perhaps bicycle, though the weight made the last possibility less comfortable. The samples inside were arranged by price. Economical papers came first, then better bedrooms, superior parlors, and finally embossed papers with small glints of mica. The economical pages were the most worn. Customers had touched them, bent their corners, and perhaps held them beside curtain fabric. One pale yellow paper carried a pattern of tiny linked rings. A note beside it said "Good light, forgiving." Edwin paused over forgiving. Wallpaper could indeed forgive. A busy pattern softened uneven plaster. A warm tint made a northern room less stern. Vertical stripes lent height to a ceiling that had not actually moved. Even the seams, if aligned with care, could agree to become nearly invisible. The paper did not repair a wall, it merely offered the wall a polite new account of itself. He entered Mr. Preece's book into the catalogue and counted 96 specimens. Counting wallpaper samples was slower than counting pages because several specimens could share a leaf, and narrow border strips sometimes hid beneath folded guards. Edwin used a tally sheet divided into groups of 5. For short pencil marks and a diagonal made a tiny gate, then another gate, until the total emerged. At sample 63 he found a fragment printed with brown acorns and green oak leaves. At sample 64 there were brown acorns and green oak leaves in the opposite direction. This difference had been important enough to sell as a separate design. Edwin admired an industry capable of offering choice without requiring novelty. By 8:15 Edwin had completed 3 volumes. He returned to the staff room and made his second cup of tea. This time he opened his lunch bag and removed a cheese sandwich, an apple, and 2 oat biscuits stacked in a square of wax paper. The waxed paper had softened at the folds from repeated use. He ate at the table beneath the framed teaspoon notice. Rainwater ticked in a downpipe behind the wall. The refrigerator hummed, stopped, and after a thoughtful interval hummed again. Edwin cut the apple into 4 with a small pocket knife, not because this was necessary but because quarters seemed well suited to archival work. On the staffroom shelf stood reference books no longer frequently consulted, a dictionary of pigments, a directory of paper mills, and a volume titled Practical Hints for the Suburban Decorator. Edwin took down the pigment dictionary while eating his first biscuit. It opened naturally at Shields green, a brilliant color once made with arsenic. Old green wallpapers are often introduced in lively accounts of poison, illness, and dramatic drawing rooms, but the archive treated them more quietly. Samples were enclosed, handling procedures were clear, and the green rested beneath tissue, no longer expected to decorate anything. Edwin preferred to think of pigments as retired workers. Some had been industrious, some troublesome, and most now spent their days being occasionally inspected by people wearing gloves. He returned the dictionary exactly between the mill directory and the suburban hints, carried his empty plate to the sink, and rinsed the teaspoon with a diligence that would have pleased the notice. Back in the main room, the lamps appeared warmer after the white light of the staff room. Shelf Run D extended ahead in orderly shadow. Edwin resumed with a slim maroon album containing nursery borders. Ducks marched along one strip carrying umbrellas. Bears sat on stools on another. A procession of rabbits pushed wheelbarrows filled with objects too round to identify. The draftsman had given every animal a mild expression, as if the nursery world were run by a competent committee. Nursery wallpapers were often installed above wooden paneling or below a picture rail, limiting the amount required and keeping the most engaging figures near a child's eye level. Borders allowed a room to be altered without covering every wall. They could run around doors, turn corners, and disappear behind wardrobes where several inches might remain unfaded for decades. Conservators sometimes found these hidden stretches during renovation, small private sunsets untouched by smoke or sunlight. Edwin had once visited a house where a wardrobe preserved 3 blue elephants behind it. The rest had become grey. The protected elephants looked almost impertinently fresh, though they had done nothing but stand still. He measured the rabbit borders, repeat, 22 centimeters from wheelbarrow to wheelbarrow. A repeat is the unit from which the wider pattern continues, its joins designed to vanish into rhythm. On a wall, the eye understands repetition quickly and then ceases to inspect it. That is one reason wallpaper can make a room restful. Once the rule is learned, little remains to be decided. Leaf follows leaf, stripe follows stripe, wheelbarrow follows wheelbarrow. Even an energetic rabbit becomes soothing when obliged to push the same load forever at measured intervals. The archive heating came on at 9 with a hollow knock in the pipes. Warmth traveled gradually along the radiators, bringing out the faint scent of iron and dust. Edwin turned the nearest valve a quarter turn. The room did not need to be warm, only stable. Paper disliked sudden changes and expressed its displeasure through carkling, brittleness, and warped boards. It preferred moderate conditions day after day. Edwin considered this reasonable. Many people would also choose a steady temperature, low light, and freedom from damp fingers. Volume 7 was a ledger of orders rather than a sample book. Its pages listed customers, room dimensions, roll counts, and paste quantities for a decorating firm operating between 1911 and 1914. Mrs. Ellison, front bedroom, 9 rolls. Railway Hotel, passage and upper landing, 23 rolls. Mr. Cobb, box room, 3 rolls and 1 border. The rooms themselves were absent, and perhaps most of the buildings had changed, yet their measurements persisted in blue-black ink. Edwin read them without attempting to imagine grand biographies. He thought instead about upper landings, the quiet turn at the top of stairs, the window sometimes placed there, the narrow table that holds a bowl no one uses. Wallpaper paste had a history as practical and bland as porridge. Flour and water, starch and water, cellulose powder and water, the main achievement was stickiness spread in a thin, obedient layer. Old manuals advised allowing paste to swell and resting cut lengths after brushing so the paper could expand before hanging. A decorator folded the pasted strip loosely upon itself in a method called booking. The word made Edwin smile because here, among books made of wallpaper, wallpaper itself could also be booked. He wrote this thought on no form. Some observations are improved by remaining administratively unnecessary. At the far end of the room, a pipe gave a soft ping. Edwin finished recording the ledger and moved to a collection donated by the Grand Temperance Hotel after its renovation. The hotel's name suggested imposing corridors, but its papers were remarkably timid. Beige trellises, buff stripes, small cream medallions, and one pattern described as stone that resembled toast. Hotels often chose designs able to receive many different guests without introducing themselves too strongly. A wall that says very little can be excellent company. These samples had lined bedrooms where travelers unpacked brushes, wound watches, folded train tickets, and slept beneath unfamiliar ceilings. The stone pattern came in 4 shades: Portland, Bath, Sand, and Antique. None looked convincingly like stone under the magnifying glass. Tiny printed dots formed loose clouds, and thin lines suggested joints between blocks. Yet viewed from several paces away, it acquired a mild architectural confidence. Edwin placed it on the inspection stand and stepped back. The paper seemed to say that the wall had always intended to be masonry but was content not to insist. He noted slight abrasion, lower right, and returned it to its tissue guard. Around 10, the rain eased. Drops remained on the windows, each holding a small inverted lamp. Beyond the glass, rooftops shone under streetlights. A delivery van passed along the road with the gentle swish of tires on wet paving, then the archive settled again. Edwin heard the building in layers: clock, radiator, distant refrigerator, the soft contact of paper, and his slippers moving over boards. Quiet rooms are rarely silent. They contain many modest sounds that become visible to the ear only after louder things have gone home. The 11th volume was covered in blue cloth and fastened by 2 cotton straps. It contained flock wallpapers, their raised patterns made by applying chopped fibers to adhesive. Edwin loosened the straps and opened it carefully. The first specimen was crimson with a darker crimson vine, velvety even after many years. Flock papers had once imitated costly textiles. Wool waste was ground, dyed, sifted, and made to stand on the prepared design. The process transformed scraps into grandeur by means of glue and confidence. Under magnification, the surface resembled a field after an unusually tidy snowfall. Edwin did not stroke the flock, though it invited the finger. Instead, he moved the lamp sideways so shadows described the raised leaves. Some fibers had worn away, revealing the printed adhesive beneath. Where has its own map? The center of a sample may remain full while edges become smooth from handling, a wall fades near windows and darkens behind pictures, stair corners collect the passing touch of shoulders. The archive recorded such changes without scolding them. Objects are permitted to show that people have lived near them. The next books proceeded without surprise. There were stripes of varying confidence, roses of varying accuracy, and geometric forms whose names required consultation with a chart. Edwin distinguished lozenges from diamonds, catafoils from 4-petaled flowers, and vermiculation from a general abundance of squiggles. Vermiculation derived from a word for little worms, though on walls it appeared dignified, especially when printed in grey. Language could perform the same service as wallpaper, giving ordinary material a more furnished appearance. He came next to a book from Hargreaves and Sons, established 1842, makers of hand-block papers. Its pages displayed registration marks at the edges where separate carved blocks had been aligned for each color. A green leaf might require 1 block, its dark vein another, the flower a 3rd, and the background perhaps a 4th. The printer placed the block, pressed or struck it, lifted it, and moved along the length with measured care. Minor misalignments gave the patterns a breathing edge. Blue sometimes rested a fraction beyond its outline. Yellow showed at the side of a petal. Perfection would have made the paper flatter, the tiny departures made it quietly human. The archive owned several wooden printing blocks in another room. They were thick pieces of pear wood backed with pine, their designs built from carved wood and inserted brass pins. Edwin had helped count them one winter. There were 819, plus a fragment catalogued as possibly block, which looked much like a well-used chopping board. Each block was heavy enough to make admiration practical. In the Hargreaves book, a pattern of grey willow leaves required 7 colors, although at first glance it appeared to require 3. Edwin followed the printer's annotations: ground, shadow, pale green, middle green, dark green, vein, highlight. The distinction between pale and middle green was nearly invisible in the evening light. He adjusted the lamp but did not decide immediately. Some colors benefit from being allowed to remain uncertain. He described the pattern as greens and gray, plural but unnumbered, an accurate shelter for ambiguity. Close to midnight, Edwin reached the halfway point. He knew this because volume 24 had an old paper marker reading half bay in Miss Barlow's square handwriting. The marker served no current cataloguing purpose, yet no one had removed it. Edwin made a cup of hot water with a slice of lemon, then stood by the window while it cooled. The street was empty. Rain had polished the stone sill outside, and a few wet leaves lay flat on the pavement like dark envelopes. From a chimney across the road came a thread of smoke that drifted sideways and disappeared into the low cloud. Night work altered the archive without changing any of its contents. During the day, visitors whispered at the tables, phones rang in the office, and carts moved between rooms. At night, the sample books seemed less like research material and more like sleeping animals, broad-backed and patient. Edwin never thought them lonely. They had abundant company, and very little was expected of them. A collection can be a form of rest, thousands of objects relieved, at last, from having to be useful in the ordinary way. Volume 24 contained ceiling papers. These were usually pale, with small motifs designed to be viewed from below and at some distance. Stars, dots, feathery leaves, and plaster-like rosettes filled the pages. Ceilings receive less notice than walls, although they occupy a whole side of every room. People look up to change a bulb, inspect a stain, or consider sleep. A ceiling paper rewarded this occasional attention without demanding it. One sample scattered tiny gold stars across ivory. The stars were not astronomically arranged. They formed a simple diagonal repeat, a universe governed by the width of a printing roller. Edwin wondered how many people had counted those stars while waiting for sleep. The complete sample held 83, but across a bedroom ceiling there might have been thousands, interrupted by a rose fitting and a cord for the light. A sleeper might follow rose until the pattern slipped out of arithmetic and became only a soft field overhead. Edwin counted the sample once for condition reporting and then did not count it again. 83 was sufficient knowledge for one night. The volumes after midnight were mostly from the 1950s and 1960s, when patterns widened and colors acquired names such as Festival Red, Seafoam, Coffee, and Atomic Gold. A sample called Coffee was the color of weak cocoa. Seafoam was pale green, though actual seafoam observed near the provincial coast was generally white with a tendency toward beige. Commercial color names described aspirations rather than evidence. Edwin entered them exactly as printed, preserving each small act of optimism. One 1956 book offered coordinated papers for kitchen, breakfast room, and utility space. The kitchen design showed spoons, kettles, and fish arranged in tidy squares. The fish looked well organized and not recently aquatic. The breakfast pattern featured cups sending up identical curls of steam. The utility paper contained pegs, buckets, and brushes, turning household work into a decorative procession. Edwin enjoyed the way ordinary objects had been asked to pose. A bucket repeated every 30 centimeters becomes less a bucket than a reliable blue curve. He found a handwritten order tucked beside the kitchen papers: 2 rolls blue utensil, 1 packet paste, deliver Thursday. There was no address. Perhaps the note had never become an order, or perhaps everyone involved once knew exactly where Thursday's blue utensils belonged. Edwin placed the note in a polyester sleeve and assigned it a related material number. Archives are hospitable to scraps whose context has gone out for a moment and failed to return. At 1:15 the building settled with a long, soft creak. Edwin moved on to washable vinyl samples, thicker and cooler than the earlier papers. Their surfaces carried shallow embossing, linen, bark, plaster, and something called rustic grain. Synthetic coverings promised durability and easy cleaning. They resisted splashes, fingerprints, and the mild chaos of soup. Some were so robust that removing them later proved a separate trade. Edwin had seen decorators peel vinyl from walls in broad, flexible sheets, revealing the paper backing below like a second, quieter wallpaper. The vinyl book's color range ran from almond to mushroom through several beiges that appeared almost identical. Edwin laid 3 beside one another. Under the lamp, almond leaned yellow, mushroom leaned gray, and putty maintained a firm neutrality. Beige is sometimes treated as the absence of decision, but the archive demonstrated how carefully indecision could be graded. Warm beige, cool beige, pink beige, stone beige, each weighted to agree with a carpet, a lampshade, or a sofa whose exact brown had already been chosen. He recorded surface cracking on the almond sample and slight plasticizer migration on mushroom. Technical phrases made the slow changes of material sound like travel. Plasticizers could migrate, dyes could bleed, adhesives could fail. In practice, the mushroom sample remained exactly where it had been since accession, changing by degrees too small for the evening eye. Edwin slid fresh tissue between the leaves and closed the cover. Preservation was often the art of arranging for things to happen more slowly. The remaining shelf held panoramic papers, landscapes printed in numbered drops that joined to form a continuous scene around a room. Mountains rose behind lakes, shepherds stood near ruins, distant cities appeared conveniently free of traffic. These papers were not repetitive in the usual way, so installers had to keep each strip in sequence. Strip 4 could not casually exchange places with Strip 9 without moving a bridge into a hillside. The sets arrived with diagrams, and the diagrams resembled calm instructions for assembling a very flat world. One panorama depicted a river valley in soft gray and blue. Edwin spread the reference photograph on the table. In the original room, the river traveled behind a cabinet, emerged beside a fireplace, crossed a corner, and vanished at a door frame. No one viewing the room could see the entire landscape at once. This did not diminish it. Most real landscapes are also interrupted by buildings, trees, weather, and the limits of turning one's head. The wallpaper offered continuity without requiring a complete view. Edwin catalogued the panorama strip by strip. He noted mill decal edges, block registration, old repairs, and the numbers penciled on the reverse. Strip 6 showed a footpath with no person on it. Strip 7 continued the path past 2 trees. Strip 8 allowed it to fade into pale ground. It was a destinationless path, included simply because a valley often has one. Edwin found it especially restful. No traveler approached. No appointment waited beyond the trees. The path performed the modest duty of being passable. At 2 o'clock he ate the second oat biscuit, now slightly softened by its hours in waxed paper. He drank water and stretched his shoulders. The archive lamps cast long rectangles across the floor, and the shelves beyond Bay 12 receded into darkness. He had completed 38 volumes. 9 remained. The number felt neither large nor small. It was simply the present shape of the work. Volume 39 came from a seaside boarding house and contained fragments removed during repairs. Unlike clean manufacturer's samples, these carried traces of walls, plaster dust, paste, pencil marks, and lead edges. One fragment included 3 generations of paper. The top layer was striped, beneath it lay pink roses, and beneath the roses a brown lattice rested against thin lining paper. Houses often kept their decorative history in layers because stripping was laborious and yesterday's paper made a convenient base for tomorrow's. Edwin examined the cross-section with the magnifying glass. The layers formed a small geological record of taste. Brown lattice, perhaps 1890s. Pink roses, early 20th century. Narrow stripe, later still. Dates remained approximate because patterns lingered in catalogues, stock sat in shops, and householders chose according to preference rather than future scholarship. History seldom changes its wallpaper on schedule. Edwin wrote circa with care, a useful word meaning near enough for the available evidence. The boarding house fragment smelled faintly of chalk and old paste. One had faded around the silhouette of a small rectangular picture. The protected area showed deeper blue stripes, while the exposed field had become grey. Edwin pictured no particular picture in the rectangle. It might have been a print of a harbour, a certificate, or a photograph of someone standing beside a hydrangea. The blank shape was enough. It marked years of stillness more clearly than the missing object could have done. Volume 42 was devoted entirely to borders resembling architectural mouldings. Printed shadows made flat paper appear raised. Egg and dart, bead and reel, dentils, acanthus, and several forms described simply as classic ran in narrow bands. Dentils take their name from teeth, though architectural dentils are square and evenly behaved. Edwin thought dentists might appreciate the improvement. He measured a bead and reel strip and entered ochre, cream, grey shading. From arm's length it looked like plaster. From 6 inches it looked like a very sincere drawing of plaster. The last 5 books were small retail collections from the 1970s. Their covers were orange, brown, and green in combinations that made the decade immediately apparent. Inside were oversized daisies, looping lines, grids, and rounded rectangles nested within other rounded rectangles. Edwin felt no need to make jokes about them. Every period eventually becomes a pattern in somebody else's archive. The large flowers had once seemed cheerful and new. Now they had become calm through distance, like music heard faintly from another room. One page had been marked Family Choice in blue pencil. The chosen pattern was a field of overlapping tan circles on cream. A second hand had written Hall beside it. The question mark remained unresolved. Edwin imagined a family holding the book near the hall carpet, discussing whether circles were too lively for the stairs. Perhaps they chose them. Perhaps they went home with a stripe. The catalogue preserved the hesitation, which was more ordinary and perhaps more truthful than a final answer. At 3:10 Edwin lifted the 47th and final book onto the foam wedges. It was neither splendid nor ancient. Issued in 1984, it contained small textured papers for offices, waiting rooms, and corridors. The cover bore a coffee ring. Inside, the designs had names like Parchment, Fine Weave, Quiet Sand, and Executive Hessian. Quiet Sand was pale grey with tiny darker flecks. Edwin approved of the name. Sand, already known for lying still in large quantities, had here been made quieter. He turned the pages slowly. These papers were intended to recede behind filing cabinets, notice boards, rubber plants, and rows of chairs. They had witnessed appointments, forms completed on clipboards, coats folded over knees, and clocks consulted without enthusiasm. Their lack of distinction was a professional quality. A waiting room wall should not begin a complicated relationship with everyone who sits beside it. Quiet Sand offered mild texture, acceptable durability, and no opinion. The final specimen was called Linen White. It was not white but a soft warm grey, embossed with crossing threads. Edwin measured the repeat, though the texture was random enough to conceal it. He described the condition as good, with minor handling soil at lower edge. He counted the leaves, checked the count, entered the dimensions, and saved the record. The computer gave no fanfare. A small green line appeared beside the accession number, indicating that required fields were complete. Edwin printed the last label. The printer woke with a whir, drew in the sheet, and produced D12A047 in crisp black type. He trimmed it on the mark board, brushed the book's spine, and placed the label beneath a clear protective strip. Then he returned the volume to Bay 12, where it lay beside its 46 companions. The shelf looked almost exactly as it had at the beginning of the night. Only the labels differed, aligned along the lower left corners like small clean windows. He did not stand back in triumph. Triumph would have been too energetic for 3:30. Instead, he wheeled the trolley to the work table and returned each tool to its drawer. The goat hair brush went into its paper sleeve. The ruler hung from a hook. The bone folder rested in a shallow tray. He folded the grey cloth around the magnifying glass and set the foam wedges on the lower shelf. The trolley's wheel squeaked once on the way to its alcove, completing another quiet revolution. Edwin updated the ledger in ink. Shelf run D, Bay 12, labels revised, records checked, condition notes added. He wrote the date and his initials. The ink shone for a moment before sinking into the paper. Ledgers had a way of making completed work appear calm and inevitable. All the small pauses, second measurements, softened biscuits, uncertain greens, and trips to the kettle became one neat line. The rain had stopped entirely. He switched off the lamps from the far end of the room, one row at a time. Each pool of amber light withdrew, leaving shelves in blue-grey darkness. At Bay 12 he paused only long enough to check that no volume projected beyond the shelf edge. All were square. The paper gardens, urns, stripes, rivers, spoons, stars, and quiet grains rested between their boards. Without the lamps, their colors continued in darkness, requiring no one to see them. In the staff room, Edwin rinsed his mug and placed it upside down on the draining cloth. He folded the waxed paper from his lunch into a small rectangle and returned it to the canvas bag. His outdoor shoes felt cool when he put them on. He buttoned his coat, leaving the top button open, and glanced at the framed teaspoon notice. The teaspoon was clean. The cupboard was shut. The kettle held a little water, exactly as expected. He descended the stairs with one hand on the brass rail. The building smelled cooler near the ground floor, with a trace of stone and wet pavement entering around the door. Outside, the clouds had thinned enough to show a pale area where morning would eventually appear, though morning seemed in no hurry. The streetlights remained on. Water gathered in the shallow joints between paving stones, reflecting windows, lintels, and a portion of the carved date. Edwin locked the side door and tested it gently. Then he began walking home beneath the dripping plane trees. His route passed a closed bakery, a row of dark offices, and a shop whose window displayed 3 rolls of modern wallpaper. One was cream with fine grey lines. One carried green leaves. The third was a beige so carefully balanced that it seemed likely to agree with almost anything. Edwin looked at them for a moment, warmly, then continued along the quiet street while somewhere behind him, on an upper shelf in the old warehouse, 47 newly labeled books lay flat and still, their repeats continuing from leaf to leaf, line after line, flower after flower, all the way into the soft, unmeasured hours.